Afterwards, when it was too late, people said they ought never to have married. "It is always a risk," said the wiseacres, "for two artists, and when one of them is a wild untamed genius like young Carstairs, well, it's madness, pure madness, and Nan deserved all she got." And then, thinking of Nan's face, so white against her black bobbed hair, and the tragic blue stare of her wide eyes, they would sometimes wish they hadn't said that. The studio wasn't in or even near Chelsea. For one thing, Chelsea was dear. For another, it was obvious. For a third, it was crowded. So finally Carstairs, who knew every byway of London as a shepherd knows each nook on the moors where he spends his quiet days, found the place in an odd little paved court near the law courts. It was a long, low room that had been used as a store, a gymnasium, a church-room, a socialist club, a dance-hall, and heaven only knows what as well. It had a sort of dignity from its very usefulness. Its proportions were good, honest lines that gave it even a sort of beauty. Inside, its length was not as great as appeared from without, because two rooms had been cut off. One, a tiny cupboard that Nan said she could use as a kitchen, and one big enough for a bedroom. The rest was the studio, and Carstairs had extra windows put in to get the right light. It was very quiet, that long, low studio. Its big, clear windows looked out onto a little paved court, surrounded by a wall of old brick. Pale, tender grass sprouted up between the paving stones, and in the middle of the little yard there was a huge, spreading ash tree. It was the tree that made Nan long for the place. "It'll be like a picnic," she said, "living in a barn with the tree overhead like an extra roof." "I don't like the tree," said Rolf Carstairs, with that stubborn air he sometimes had that made him look like a nice, sturdy boy of about 10. "It's too close," he added, and Nan suddenly had an odd fancy that he looked afraid, like a small boy who won't own that he is scared. Not that the tree darkened the studio. Far from it. It filled the place with a green, quivering light that made you think of sand-strewn caverns, cool and deep, where the winds are all asleep. It was romantic, mysterious. It had the same effect of magic and gnomes that you feel in deep, damp woodland dells in the height of a hot summer. But Carstairs didn't feel it like that. He didn't like it. "It's too close," he repeated, and explained that he meant near, not the other kind of close. It was intrusive, he said, feeling for the right word, predominant, looming too large. And Nan, who was quite extraordinarily sweet and unselfish, in spite of her 22 years and her freelance journalist's life, agreed with a sigh that it must come down if Rolf felt like that about it. Because he was going to be great, and nothing must interfere with his work. So Carstairs wrote to the landlady, and the day was fixed for the execution, for somehow you felt it like that. The tree had such a personality. It was, as Rolf said, so dominant. The men came to prepare it on the evening before they were to cut it down. It was April, and a lovely evening of misty gold, the sort of evening that makes you think of budding woods and primroses starry in deep hedges, and birds building and fluting to one another. Carstairs was tired. He had been painting all day, and the spring was in his blood like a madness. He went to the windows for the felling of the tree, and then he turned back into the studio with a sigh of mingled relief and regret. For trees in April have a kind of claim, and the ash tree reared itself so magnificently against the pale clear sky, where already a faint star gleamed. Nan was in her cupboard kitchen, cooking supper in a saucepan over a gas ring. When she came in to lay the table, Ralph was lying on the couch, asleep. He looked so infinitely tired that she decided not to disturb him, and sat down to wait till he should awake. He was dreaming, not dreaming happily with the bliss of deep repose after a long spell of work, but restlessly, turning his head from side to side and muttering a little. Soon she could even hear what he said. 1, 2, 3, he whispered. Listen to them. Heavy, heavy, striking at it. How strong it is. Will it never fall? Oh, I can't bear it, he suddenly cried out, starting up on the couch. Stop, stop, don't strike again. I can't bear. Nan went over, soothing him as if he had been a child. Darling, it's all right, she crooned. It's not hurt. They haven't touched it yet. It's all right, Ralph. He turned on her bewildered eyes, dazed with dreams. I thought they were cutting down the tree, he muttered. It's horrible. Murderous. It hurt me. They were striking at me, too. He paused, puzzled. Already the vividness of the dream impression was fading. They struck and struck at it. It wouldn't fall, he said, then urgently. It's still there, Nan, isn't it? Yes, sweetheart, she answered quietly. Her heart ached for him, though she couldn't understand his anguish. His rumpled hair and bewildered eyes made him look so like a small boy. He looked out of the window. The great branches spread and soared against the pale sky. The lines of the ropes placed by the workmen clung to it like the monstrous tentacles of some vile reptile seeking to sap its mighty strength. Nan, they mustn't go on. I must stop it. Nan, do you understand? I must stop it. All right, old thing, said Nan tranquilly. Go round now and tell them not to do it. Give them something for their trouble. I'll have supper ready when you get back. And so the tree was spared, and Nan, who had always loved it, with a warmth she could hardly explain even to herself, could have sung with glee. All that spring she rejoiced whenever she looked at it. It wasn't till she saw Ralph's big picture that she began to regret. She knew the idea of the picture. It was to be called Dawn. It was a dim, half-light picture of a stretch of rough, heathery ground, barred by a wet, rutty track, gleaming in the silver light of a cold dawn. There was in the picture a physical feeling of wet, chill, pure air. You could feel it on your face. And it was spacious and vast, so that you got an impression of the unity of earth and sky, and the feeling of that pause that seems to come into the life of things just at the dawn. And when Nan looked at it late in May, Ralph had painted into it the ash tree. It loomed up in the foreground, malignant as ash trees are malignant, and the meaning of the picture, its purity and cold truth, were lost in romantic suggestion. Oh, Ralph, cried Nan, I don't like the tree. Ralph looked at her oddly and said nothing. Why did you put it in? She wailed. It's wicked, witchcrafty, and your picture was so cold and pure and quiet. He laughed a hard, almost cruel little laugh. Good for you, Nan, he said, almost with a sneer. Didn't you know that ash trees were the special property of witches? I don't know. But why have you put it in, Ralph? It's spoiling it. Can't you paint it out? Get rid of it, do. He looked at her, and she felt quite suddenly and unreasoningly afraid. I can't get rid of it now, he said slowly. I missed my chance. I shall never get rid of it now. I don't mean the real tree, cried Nan, rather pale. What is real? he asked sombrely, and she was silent. The picture was rejected. A man who was on the selection committee and had known Nan in her bachelor days told her in confidence that it was the fault of the tree. "It's in the wrong key," he said. "It spoils the atmosphere." Those words haunted her. "It spoils the atmosphere," she thought, moving about the green-shadowed studio. "It spoils the atmosphere," she thought, as she lay in bed and watched its royal branches stirring a little against the quiet sky. She grew to hate the tree. That was a very trying summer. Nan herself was unusually irritable and depressed, and she thought that perhaps the difference she felt in Ralph was as much her fault as his. At least she tried to think so. She was busy with her journalistic work, and when she saw how things were going, she wisely kept out of Ralph's way as much as she could. There was no use, she told herself, in getting on each other's nerves more than was necessary. But she had an odd feeling of being out of it whenever she returned to the studio. She just didn't belong. She must, I think, have guessed a little, but it was not until July that she knew for certain. One afternoon towards the end of the month she came in to find Ralph holding a kind of review of all his work for the past weeks, ever since March, in fact. There were a good many paintings, and the ash tree was in them all. It dominated Ralph's work as it dominated the studio. Yes, as far as she now knew it, it dominated Ralph himself. Great, uncanny, suggestive and beautiful, it reigned in them all. Even in the portrait of Sir Evan Penrith, that commission that had meant such a feather in Ralph's cap, the tree reared itself above the crude, hasty portrait, threatening and insistent. It was in the work like a subtle poison. Nan felt suddenly and terribly afraid. She said nothing, but she looked up at the great tree, dark against the blazing blue of the sky, and she felt certain that it knew. This was vengeance, she thought, and she felt terribly impotent and small and desolate. She said not a word about the pictures, and Ralph never seemed to notice her silence. His eyes were fixed on the tree, as if he expected something. Nan didn't give it a name. Nan was plucky, but she was not the stuff of which criminals are made. She was not sufficiently ruthless. It needed a great, almost an incredible effort for her to decide on the steps she took. But of one thing she was sure. That tree was becoming part of Ralph. It was obsessing him, his thoughts, his work, his very being, and she believed that only by the death of the tree could she free him from its mastery. She could not have it cut down. Ralph would prevent that. But there were other ways of killing a tree. How she first heard of it I have no idea. I know that she had dealings with an old Sussex man she'd come up against in Limehouse in her journalist life, a man who had been a diviner and knew strange secrets of the earth, and I know it was from him that she got the stuff she used. But I know no more than that, and I can't ask her. Anyhow, her courage and her love helping her, she did it. She poisoned the ash tree. That was a very sultry August, full of storms that never broke, with an air like grey wool and a sky livid with heat. Nan is imaginative, artistic, highly strung. I don't know. Perhaps she is mistaken. But I don't believe she is. Once, in the height of her distress, she said a few words that gave a clue. She had cut the bark, she said, slipping out at night under the moon to do it. She smeared the stuff in the wound she made. She hated doing it, she said, with a little shuddering gasp. Hated it. It was treacherous, loathsome. But it was the tree or Ralph, and that of course meant that she had no choice, and she told herself that every time she made another little wound and rubbed the poison stealthily in. At first she felt almost happy. Her heart was at ease because she had taken the great step. She was saving Ralph, she thought, and that upheld her when her heart smote her for the murdered tree, already drooping a little in its topmost branches, and sicklied in the rich green of its leaves. The studio was gaspingly hot, and she always felt restless in there because of the doomed tree drooping at the window, and so she took to avoiding the place, slipping out by herself, telling herself that she was glad because she was saving Ralph. When Ralph first began to flag, she thought it was the heat. If only it would thunder! If only it would thunder! She used to murmur wistfully, watching him as he sat idle, silent and brooding, his head drooping forward, his eyes fixed vacantly. But the thunder hung in the air, or only growled sullenly far off, and the air lay on your lungs like a poultice, hot and clammy. One day Ralph suddenly spoke. "Nan," he said, "what's the matter with the ash tree?" There was something like mockery in his listless voice as he spoke. Nan glanced up, startled and guilty, but he was not looking at her. He was staring out at the tree. It was drooping now in all its branches. Its pale leaves hung like dead things in the languid air. In every line it spoke of decay and death. "I expect the heat," murmured Nan. "Yes, the heat, and that's what you think is wrong with me, too." "Yes, you're right. The same with us both, of course it is. You know, Nan," he said, suddenly facing round and looking at her with an odd, wild smile. "We're connected, that tree and I. You knew that, of course. You felt it. That's why I couldn't kill it. It meant killing myself." Nan's heart stopped beating. She stared at him in wild alarm and horror, for she suddenly knew that it was the truth. And now it was too late. The poison had done its work.